8 o'clock.
No. How do I use a computer? Here we go. Hello, Stephen and Lachlan. I think we're unmuted now, and it's still playing that damn song.
Is it working? Okay. Should I tweet? I'm going to tweet now.
Yeah, definitely tweet. So I'm not sure if anyone's joined us because this is just a standard podcast thing, but we thought we'd try a live. So I'm joined with Stephen Hamilton and Lachlan Vass. I'm not going to introduce them because anyone who's here knows them better than they know me. It's election day. We're excited. We want to just meet up, have some drinks and chat about it. It is Saturday morning here. I'm going to the doctor soon, so I probably won't be drinking any beer this time. But I think, Stephen, you have some champagne, don't you?
Yeah, I don't have beer. I have champagne. I do. I have a fridge right there, and I have a lot of beer in there. But I was like, no, it's a special occasion. I want to crack open this bottle of champagne. Can you tell how many people? Is anyone on?
That's
any
a
way
great
to do that? Maybe on the YouTube live thing. Maybe it'll do it because there's like a YouTube live thing, isn't it?
This is true. So
I could just click the link and see what happens.
It says that
one watching,
which will be myself.
So no one is watching.
All good. But we'll get to chatting, and if people turn up, they turn up. If they don't, they don't. We didn't really want. Oh, it actually tells us in the top left anyway. So for our chat, we were quite keen to talk about the different policies of the different political parties, right? So with that, there's this great ABC and Conversation article, and there's two of them that go through the policies. We can chat through that a bit, talk about specifics. But what's really
Are you ready? Hang on, are you ready?
Yeah.
I'll put it right next to my ear. There we go.
Oh, nice.
I assume it's celebrating the quality of policy in this campaign, right, Stan?
Oh yeah, particularly the outcome.
Yeah.
And it could go either way. No, I think Albanese is going to win, and I think he's going to win a majority. I think that's pretty clear.
Majority. Well, I'm hoping that the independence is still there because at the start of the year, I made that prediction. And so I just want to be right because, as an economist, I'm barely ever right. So I just like
cheers, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, very good. So I think I'm pretty clear that I'm pretty confident that that's what it'll be. At least 75. And I think the Libs will probably get back. Maybe they'll get back one or two Teal seats. There's a couple of other seats they might get back. But basically, I think anything they gain, I think, will be offset by Labor gains. And so I think we'll see. We'll see tonight. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's pretty similar numbers to what we had before. And I think if that's the case, Dutton has, committed a political failure on the scale of John Hewson in 1993.
At least in expectations management.
Do you know what that is, Nolan? I don't know if you know that.
I've no idea.
Do you know about the birthday cake?
No.
Oh my God! You have to read. You have to watch the birthday cake video. We got to talk. We got to tell this. Yeah, we got to tell this story. So John, you know who John Hewson is?
Nah.
Yeah. So he writes. No. We'll chat about it. He writes for the Monthly, I think it is, or what's the Saturday paper. He does one of those things, yeah. And he has a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins. So he's a bit like Mark Carney becoming the Prime Minister. One of us. And so he was. I think he was. Funnily enough, I think Tony Abbott worked in his office when he was opposition leader. And so he was a proper academic economist here in the US. Actually, he went back to Australia and then worked in politics, worked in finance, worked in a few different places, was involved in some policy stuff. He found himself in Parliament and was the leader of the opposition in the 1993 election, which Australia called the unlosable election, because people were said to be waiting for Paul Keating with baseball bats, because this was in the wake of the very, very bad early 1990s recession, very high interest rates, very high unemployment, and that's why it was the unlosable election. And he proposed. He's the only opposition leader, in modern Australian history, to go to an election with effectively a manifesto.
Yeah,
and it was called "Fight Back," with an exclamation point. And it proposed a GST, a VAT. It proposed radical industrial relations deregulation, welfare reform. It proposed all sorts of wild, radical libertarian fantasies, and there's a moment with Mike Willesee on, I think it was the 7:30 report or something like that, where Mike Willesee asks him to explain how his proposed GST would affect the price of a birthday cake. And it is one of the most excruciating political moments in Australian history. And you can see it on YouTube, and it is glorious because he's asking, it depends, what's the frosting, what's this, what's that? And it sort of just highlights, you can't, the insanity of going to an election as an opposition leader with really complex and elaborate policy proposals. But two, just being completely inept in selling and explaining things. And so, Houston lost that election. It was shocking. Nobody thought Keating would win. And Keating gave that famous speech saying, "This is a win for the true believers." He had toppled Hawke, just a couple of years prior. And he won. And it's gone down in history as like this epic, failure of an opposition leader. So I am putting, if Dutton does not gain seats on net, if Labor does not lose seats on net, I would suggest this is a loss for the opposition, given the context, given how bad the economic conditions are, given how, unpopular the government was in the wake of The Voice losing resoundingly and other things. If Dutton cannot meaningfully, put a dent in the government, he has, an abject failure on his sort of record.
Yeah, and the context for it, right, is Trump. Like, a lot of what's affecting it is the fact that Trump's there. And I think when we think about, because we're going to be talking about economic policy today, it sort of doesn't matter who wins because the two parties have such minor differences. It's not like electing a Trump and then they're going to tear apart the Australian economy.
I agree with that, but I would disagree with the. I would disagree with the claim that it doesn't matter.
Really? I'd love to hear.
So we can talk about that later, but I would disagree with that claim. But yeah, we can get into it.
The other relevant piece of electoral history, now that we're an election podcast and not a economics podcast, based on the first.
It's all the same. It's all the same thing. Yeah.
it's all an endogenous system, right? So people use Fight Back under John Huston, and then the 2019 under Bill Shorten for this argument that you can't have a big target, you can't have, big policy going to an election campaign, which I think segues nicely into what we can talk about today. I don't buy that as much. I think it's in the way you package it and sell it as opposed to the ideas themselves, but happy to have that debate.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all. I think it's a bit of both, But yeah.
Yeah. And then on the worst campaign since Houston, at least for a coalition opposition, I think it's been a bad campaign. I don't think they've run a bad strategy over the last 3 years. I think what they've done really poorly is expectations management. So historically, I think it's back to World War II to see a first-term government not returned in some form, whether it's minority or majority. And so when the coalition were flying high in the polls, they built themselves up. And even in recent, they've obviously got slightly different polling to everyone else in recent weeks. They've been going out there saying, we can still win this. We're in a good position. And that builds expectation. So instead of, winning 5 seats being the bar for Dutton, 5 seats now looks like a terrible outcome for him, right? And partly because of what Stephen's talking about here, rampant inflation, declining living standards. They've also built themselves up a lot. Whereas most oppositions would say, look, we're just going to consolidate, get back, figure out what we stand for, maybe get a seat or two. 5 is a good outcome. And then
But I suspect they won't get anything.
Or with the independents subtracting from them, you reckon?
Well, I just don't think they're going to make any ground. I think they're going to have, I mean, did you see Dutton's net approval rating?
Yeah, news poll
in the news poll, 60-30.
Maybe a nice way to segue into things. So I've been sick and then moving house, and I haven't read any news for 3 days. That's why the boxes are behind me. What happened in the last 3 days? Talk me through where we're at in the campaign, where we're at in economic policy. They fixed the budget. I assume the coalition, they said they'd have a better budget line, better bottom budget line. What's been going on?
Well, let me quote the budget repair section on the ABC article. So in terms of policies, we've got a whole bunch of stuff around, we're going to ban migrants, we're going to fiddle with this, we're going to make sure we spend more and more on these different things. Then for budget repair, they've got Labour has not announced any measures dedicated to budget repair. And the coalition watched, what's that TV show that spoofs politics? And so set up a future generations fund. So in other words, they've committed to spend money, and that's somehow going to repair the budget. So realistically,
there's actually almost a line for line episode of Hollow Men that talks about this. They get to the budget, they don't know, they don't have a big policy, and so they just come up with a number first, and they got to figure out how big the number is, and then they just call it, building Australia's future or something. So it's great that the coalition ripped that off.
I want to put us in hot take mode. So I'm going to say here that when it comes
to... I said the election's going to be the worst one since 1993. I think we're already hot take mode, mate.
Is that a hot take? Again,
hot take.
I'm too far into politics, so that sounded very reasonable to me.
2016 might have had slightly better policy, but it was a pretty boring election. That was Malcolm Turnbull, who thought he deserved the premiership anyway and didn't really know how to campaign, running a 50-something day campaign against Bill Shorten, who everyone disliked. That was pretty meager. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dan, you go. Yeah.
Oh no, you go first because I'm going to go hot take mode. So
I was just going to say, the coalition released their costings, and I was flabbergasted. Genuinely, I mean, I've been flabbergasted by many things from the coalition during this campaign, some of which I've written about. Really shocked that the first 2 years they're increasing the deficit significantly. And I find that, given the rhetoric that we've heard, which has been attacking the government for its poor fiscal management, attacking the government for expanding the size of government and pushing up inflation, all of the different things, to be going to an election and not improving and making the surplus worse, the deficit worse for 2 years, I think is untenable. And I can't imagine that would have been their plan going into the election campaign. And I think that is really bad. So we'll see what voters think. But yeah, I was shocked.
Yeah. And I think it's good to start at that higher level before diving to policies, I think, because when we look at both parties, they both seem to really care about fiscal sustainability. They're uninterested in the topic. They see it as like, the minister's office teams are probably annoyed hearing people talking about it. There's been good articles by yourself, Stephen, by Richard Holden, by Chris Richardson, by Saul Eslake, by Lachlan as well, all saying that it's a problem. And that the minister's officers are probably like, shut up, man. We don't need to hear this. Now, I don't actually blame the minister's officers, although I would probably shrink them and increase the size of the core public service. And I don't blame the politicians either, and I don't blame the public. Because the thing is when you've got an information void, when you've just got these good articles being written in the week before an election and bits and pieces coming out, but you don't have the broad literacy about how these things matter, that's when you end up with a problem. So it's a lack of public discussion about how we need this fiscal discipline. It's the lack of economists being willing to say we shouldn't be spending on all this crap, but instead loving going out and talking about their pet policies. So I blame economists, and I blame the people that are talking about it more than I blame the politicians. And I think they need to be armed with people who will back them. I know that someone like Allegra Spender has come out and put out a proposal and has chatted with economists about it, is trying to play in that lane. But, you know, how come it's only one person in a seat that's quite a wealthy seat with highly educated people that has the incentive to do that? When you go back to the 90s, there would have been a much wider incentive, much wider literacy about it. So is it fair to just blame economists for this? Is fiscal sustainability a big issue? Or is it more about politicians and the public, and am I being naive?
I don't think economists matter very much. Are we recording this conversation?
I've been on record saying that previously too. So I agree.
We can scream about the deficit until the cows come home, but I'm not clear. It's not clear that now. I think we do make a difference in some sense. I mean, we puncture through in the media. We get through. We end up in newspapers. We end up on TV and the radio. You know, like I'm sure to some degree it gets through. But I would say that the marked difference in this election campaign to previous ones is how little, and I think this is the pivotal change, how little Labor cares about the deficit. Hang on. So let me just So I think I think the alternative is a response. You understand? So I think the pivotal change is Labor. Because I think I was in Treasury from 2010 to 2012, three years, and it was the sort of, it was sort of the Rudd then flipped to Gillard, period. And they were, and Jim Chalmers was a media advisor in Swan's office, and then deputy chief of staff, and then subsequently chief of staff. So he was in the office at that time. And I think that government was absolutely obsessed with a surplus. It was everything. I mean, I remember doing this. Like, I remember literally going around the department with a piece of paper trying to find offsets. Can we push this money back? Can we push this money back? And we'd always push back carbon capture and storage, Just this enormous money for carbon capture and storage. We'll just shift it back, keep shifting it back. Because they were really, they really felt, I think Wayne Swan really felt like his credibility, the credibility of the government was tied to economic management. And a surplus was inextricably linked to that because Howard and Costello had capitalized on improving the budget position after the Keating government had returned the budget to surplus. And it was their big thing, right? And so Labor coming in, they're sort of terrified as being branded as fiscally reckless. They want to reclaim this mantle of sort of fiscal responsibility, especially following the GFC when they had to rack up all this debt, to pay for stimulus. So they were terrified of being branded, economically reckless. And so there was just a obsession. And I think we don't know, but I suspect, Jim Chalmers was there at that time. He was in the room. He was pivotal to everything that was going on. And I suspect that experience has personally impacted the way he thinks about this issue. And I suspect he thinks it was a waste of time. We lost anyway. We never actually got to surplus. And it cost us too much because we were so hemmed in and constrained trying to get that surplus that we couldn't do anything. And my guess is he's now the treasurer and he thinks, I'm not going to make that same mistake. And I suspect that's loosened the government's budget constraint. And that's why we see the deficit thing kind of go out of control, frankly. Now, Lachlan's point, I think, was, it's both sides, and there's no doubt about that. But I think that the coalition's response is a best response is a best response to a government which no longer cares about getting back to surplus.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, what do I think? It's partly fair on the coalition side. So we were talking about this the other day amongst colleagues, and there was a really good point that in an election campaign, it's not about being the most popular kid in school or whatever. It's about wanting to be talking on your turf as much as possible, the things that people see as your strength. And so you go through the list that polls has put out, and health, education, blah blah is labor strength, and then fiscal sustainability or economic management is a coalition strength. And I'm not convinced the coalition's best response function is actually to loosen their budget constraint in response to the ALP loosening their budget constraint, because then they're less able to talk about fiscal sustainability and economic management as much and have that time, on their kind of, preferred turf. And so a good example is Dutton was getting up and talking about his tax cut, and then they turn around and say, well, why is this a good idea? And he's like, oh, tax cuts are a good idea. And then they say, well, you're increasing taxes, income taxes following that. And then he gets this kind of like muddled message, and then people don't really know what he's saying on economic management anymore. And so, yeah, I suppose my caveat on your comment is I'm not sure it's actually their best response function. But to your earlier question, Matt, I'm not sure how we got here. Maybe it is commentators more writ large, economists and non-economists, not talking about trade-offs enough. So Phil Curry is probably the one that I read that is constantly asking ministers, all right, how is this funded or how is this paid for? But you watch the National Press Club and you watch other events, there's very few journalists who say, okay, so you're going to spend, $2 billion on X. Where's the money coming from? Or like, what's the plan? Are we increasing taxes or are we cutting spending elsewhere? It's just like, all right, tell me more about this $2 billion you're spending on X. And then people debate whether that policy is a good idea in its kind of like little ecosystem itself, as opposed to this broader context of, trade-offs. Is it the best way we should spend money? Is this the best money we can spend in healthcare? That kind of thing.
So I think, look, it's hard to say. I mean, I guess I'm saying it's their best response in the sense that they think it is. Whether they're right or wrong is a different question, right?
But this is the thing. I think people don't realize this is the coalition is two parties. The National Party have never been economically liberal.
No.
The Liberal Party is no longer economically liberal. If you look at Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, they're not really. Yeah, but they're market interventionists who don't really believe in the power of markets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of people say. So I guess I'll say two things. A lot of people. Well, the funny thing is, I think they used to obsess too much about surpluses. And I actually was always railing against this surplus fetishism because I think it actually is also not optimal. And it led to all sorts of bad policy and stupid stuff. And I think that, the coalition leading, was so obsessed with getting back to surplus in 2019. They balanced the budget, right, in their last budget.
Mm.
They were so obsessed with getting back that we had, inflation below the RBA's target, unemployment above full employment, and we had interest rates at effectively zero at the zero lower bound at a time where we needed fiscal support to get, activity moving. But the surplus fetishism, the obsession with getting back to surplus in 2019, there's no way they were going to stimulate the economy and send the budget into deficit, right? So I don't think we want surplus fetishism either. But the question is, how can we have some balance? And I don't think we have it.
I think that's exactly right. And you can be definitely too obsessed with surpluses. There's good reasons to run deficit. There's a good reason to have a stock of net debt due to future investments and the fact that the benefit of those investments does accrue to people in the future. As someone who wasn't here in 2019, I'm just going to note the RBA's got a lot of responsibility about what happened between 2014 and 2019. If they'd been doing their job properly, there would have been less pressure on the government. But I won't ask either of you to say that. That's just what I'm going to say there. But when we're thinking about that sustainability now, so
I'm happy to endorse that view.
Yeah. The deficits that we're talking about are relatively small. Even in your recent newsletter with Aaron Wong, Lachlan, you pointed out a 2.9% deficit by 2035 if we end up having really weak productivity growth and more realistic spending assumptions. And is that really unsustainable? Where is the concern about fiscal sustainability coming from in a lot of our minds?
Good question. Didn't you write a newsletter about this yesterday, Matt?
Oh, I barely remember what I did this morning. So.
So for me, and maybe it's the ex-treasury aspect of it, and you kind of get indoctrinated. They kind of have these collective knowledge, wisdom / scars in an organization like that. So a lot of it initially in my mind is around the fiscal headspace, right? So or headroom, sorry. So we've got actually really quite low debt to GDP levels, even once you include the states, which I think people sometimes forget about the states. So always good to include compared to the rest of the OECD. But you want to make particularly small open economy, that kind of thing. You want to make sure you've got space to react, particularly, Stephen was talking about it before, if you've got the monetary policy constrained at the lower bound. And so that's one of the predominant reasons why you might want to have a fiscally sustainable plan out into the future. I think we spoke in our newsletter yesterday, Matt, about sort of having this, fair. I don't like using the term fair, so I'll give it rabbit ear quotes. But where you're spreading kind of like investment or consumption across generations, where the government's doing it on behalf of them, you kind of want a fair contribution or allocation to that. And so if you have tax rates or either revenue jumps around or you have expenditure has to be cut all of a sudden, that's kind of like not a fair smoothing across those different generations. They're kind of the two main things that come to my mind. On the piece that Aaron and I did a couple of weeks back, it was interesting. The main driver, we kind of say, you look at the budget, there's a lot of assumptions baked in and they do their best job. It's easy to pick apart someone else's assumptions. Economists do that all the time. But there's some obvious ones that were clearly not going to play out. And so there's always an assumption in the budget there's going to be no new expenditures that come up. And that's kind of like implausible. And so there's some really obvious ones in the short term, like defense, that came up straight away in the campaign that you can see coming down the pipeline. The other one is on the tax side, the idea that we have nominal tax rates, and so the idea that would never give back any bracket creep is probably a bit ambitious. And so previous governments have kind of embedded a tax to GDP ratio in their forecast to stop this occurring and to kind of impose a bit of discipline. It is a little bit arbitrary. But this government, when they came in, they scrapped that tax to GDP ratio cap. And so if you look in the medium term in the budget over 10 years, you get this improving budget balance purely because you're just getting bracket creep. And so we vary that assumption. And that's actually one of the biggest ones. And so it's an interesting one for the hot take section about what people think about indexing the brackets, the tax thresholds, because it costs a lot of money.
So did you just put my bat signal out? Was that what I just saw?
Yeah, exactly. And so and it goes to talking about trade-offs, right? So I think most economists are pro indexing the tax thresholds, but at the same time, it's terrible for fiscal sustainability. So then you either have to raise tax somewhere else, or increase the thresholds and then index them, or cut expenditure. So that's the tough.
I'm going to out my friend David Byrne at the University of Melbourne, who says appreciated commitment to the bubbles. Yes.
Yeah.
So hello, Dave.
Nice.
Thanks for tuning in, mate. You're a legend. Hey, what'd you say, Locke? Sorry.
Bubbles are great. They're comfortable. They're insular.
It's beautiful. Not enough champagne. We need to drink more champagne. We'll see what happens with the tariffs. I may be drinking less champagne. I don't know. Let me just. I agree with everything you just said, and I think. Well, we should put a pin in one point, kind of erased, which is the coalition's decision to increase the productivity assumption, which is related, right? And I think we ought to devote at least 15 minutes to that in a second. Now, let me say something, which is I think I think the question of fiscal sustainability is wildly overstated in Australia. But it's a bit of an Overton window thing. You kind of want it to be overstated in the sense that if you people don't worry about it at all, eventually you're in deep trouble, right? So, I don't mind so much that there's a little bit of sort of fear about one day becoming fiscally, in a bad position, because you've got to do it at some point, right? And the US, where I live is like 100% to GDP of debt, and woof, and it's only going up, right? So, and we got a president who's who is imploding the bond market, right? So, yeah, I think worrying about fiscal sustainability is good, but in an objective, dispassionate, sense, I don't think there's any problem with fiscal sustainability. And I think I wrote an article about this, I don't know, 2 months ago, that basically said we don't have any problem with fiscal sustainability today, but that's not going to stay the way it is forever if you keep on the path you're on.
Yeah.
Now, I would say we have to talk about the bracket creep issue, because the reason that the budget is sustainable is bracket creep. It's the only reason. Without bracket creep, we would have structural deficits forever.
Yeah.
And you look at the forecast over the medium term, and the deficit closes to zero over the next 10 years, 100% due to bracket creep. 100%. And if you take bracket creep away, all of that improvement goes away. Now, and you've done the sort of numbers. Now, the question is, as you posed it, do we, and I know the Treasury Secretary Stephen Kennedy has defended bracket creep because he thinks it is both counter-cyclical, which is true, and it has it's an inbuilt, dam against fiscal unsustainability. And yet, I am whole. Yeah. Because nominal wage growth, you get higher average tax rates. It's like an automatic brake. It's like an electric vehicle when you have one foot driving. You pull your foot off the accelerator.
I think it's asymmetric though. It's only counter-cyclical in one way. If you have a slowing economy, nominal wages keep rising, just slower, and so they still get bracket creep, just less bracket creep. It's not like it's doing negative bracket creep in a downturn.
No, but it removes more aggregate demand when the economy is hot than when it's cool.
Yeah.
That's all I mean by counter-cyclical.
Yeah.
It would have. Well, okay. Here's a fact. Bracket creep is the largest contributor to the fall in living standards in the past 3 years, right? There's been a significant.
I'm just thinking about what it does in a downturn, right? That's what I'm thinking about. But no, I agree.
Sure.
I agree. It's kind of
It's asymmetric, regardless. But the point is, it pulls. It makes people poorer when there's high inflation, and so it's disinflationary, right? Now, I would just say I have a very strong view, which is I don't care. We need to end it. We need to end it now, and I don't care what happens. I'm a single issue voter on this question, and I think that Ken Henry has come to that view for the same reasons, and I think Michael Brennan has come to that view for the same reason. I think more and more people join the club every day. What do you think, Matt? Of indexation. I can't remember if we talked about it.
Yeah. On bracket creep, I completely agree. And like the key thing for me is that you might need higher tax rates in order to, meet sustainability goals. And that's a social question you can have. Doing it through bracket creep is doing it by stealth. It's not doing it in the most efficient way. It's not doing it in the most equitable way. It's doing it without being willing to talk about the issue, which is a sort of cowardice that leads us to bad policy. But there is one thing that sustainability pilled me outside of bracket creep that just hasn't quite been mentioned. And it's demographics. It's the share of people over 75. A lot of fiscal expenditure is on people over 75, and they're all like net fiscal expenditure because a lot of them, they've fully exited the workforce, and their health costs are coming up. And, in a life cycle sense, we've agreed to support those people. We've done it in a PAYG way because of expectations about fertility and population growth that haven't held. But that share of the population between 2014 and 2035 will have increased substantially. By the time we get to 2040, it's about double where it was in 2014 as a share of the population, and it keeps increasing until it's 13% of the population in 2060. We're talking about cutting back on migration, which is one of the main ways to reduce this share by bringing in younger people. Fertility is low. And the fact that this has expenditure claims means once we get outside the 10-year window, we talk about the sustainability issues look terrible. And the IGR raises that. It says, given normal spending patterns, that's when deficits suddenly completely collapse. And that sustainability issue is long-term. And if we're not brave enough to even talk about it now, in terms of government, in terms of policy, we're going to have to ad hocly deal with it then in a much worse way. And I think that's major.
So super helps a lot, right? So the shift from super, pensions to super has meaningfully contributed to that. It'd be interesting. Someone like E61 should kind of have a look at that and look at a counterfactual in which we hadn't done super. What would the intergenerational bargain look like? I mean, I can tell you in the US, they didn't do super. Martin Feldstein, one of my heroes, my advisor's advisor, lobbied hard for privatizing Social Security through the 90s, and they didn't do it in the US. And now we think the Social Security trust fund's insolvent in 5 years. So, that's a silver lining. It's like, at least we did that. And I guess the question, it might actually using super as the having that be a hero story of how we solved this problem, to sort of talk about the problem that still remains that isn't being solved, might actually be a good device, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, and it has helped. And it's partially the reason why we aren't seeing the same pressures now, because that share's been post-COVID is when the share really started to pick up. That's when we hit that hump in our distribution. It was a bit later in Australia than it was in other countries, but it's really coming through now, and it will keep coming through to 2060. Where do we find the political will to think about that? Because I'll tell you my concern. I am a New Zealander, therefore I'm way more left-wing than you guys probably are. I want much higher average tax rates, done through GST. I just want to bring all that revenue in and redistribute it. My concern is that
it's true of me. I don't know if it's true of Lachlan.
It stays there, and then it cuts per capita spending on people in need. People that expected to receive certain health services when they retired suddenly can't get them. I'm worried about this disorganized type of spending cut.
Yeah. So when you were talking about bubbles before, Stephen, I thought you were talking about insular bubbles, and that's why I started talking about how great they are, because I live in Canberra.
No, I was talking about champagne bubbles.
Yeah. I just realized. And so when you were saying, I don't know, Matt, if you're more left than me, I was going to say the People's Republic of Ainslie, but I moved the other day.
Yeah, I think I am the sort of Attila the Hun of the podcast.
Yeah, but so every IGR points this out, Matt, over the last, they're more frequent now. And so traditionally what's happened is we've actually increased our migration program more than we expected in those IGRs. And that kind of helps us balance some of that kind of like aging demographic issue and the kind of work age ratio. But this takes me, I think, I'm gonna slide us towards hot takes because I got to go vote today, and I'm going to do it at Old Parliament House because you get a little goodie bag. So
lovely.
Yeah. But I see there's a question in the chat from the podcast biggest fan. And it says, are policy recs between Labor and opposition very different this year? And it relates to something you were just saying then, Matt. And so my hot take is actually,
how do we see the chat? I don't get it. Show chat.
There's comments.
Yeah, there's a box called comments on the far right.
Hang on. My screen was too small.
And it's a question from my favorite economist.
Yeah. And so my hot take
this is your spouse. Hello, that spouse. Is she in the next room?
Just over there.
Oh, very good.
Everyone's complaining about it being a boring election, and all the parties are the same, and so this goes to Gulnara's question: are the parties the same? I actually think there's quite a bit of difference in some of the
Yes,
policies,
I
and
agree.
there's actually some really big policies. I think it's just that one, they weren't prepared in much detail, so there's not much to talk about, and two, maybe it's the media intensity of the media cycle or something, but we haven't spent much time on some of the individual policies. So the idea of building nuclear reactors to have nuclear power, that's massive, whether you agree with it or not. It's a big policy. It's not a small target. And
Exactly.
it's
Yes.
expensive.
Now
uh,
it's stupid.
yeah, and it's
Like,
very different.
if
It's
you're going
different
to
to
choose
what
a big
the
target, don't choose an enormous, terrible target. But at least they chose a big target.
yeah, and it's very different to what the other party is proposing, right? So there's
Yeah.
differentiation there. Um, there's even things like the gas policy opposition have, right? Um, that's kind of
Also
like
stupid.
intervening in, yeah, but yeah, I'm not commenting on the economics of it. But again, it's intervening in the market to structurally adjust the economy in a way. That's kind
Mm.
of interesting. And again,
Yeah.
different.
It's not a small target election. It's not.
No, yeah, no. And
Now,
even like cutting immigration, which I don't think they actually meant to say. They committed to 25% permanent cut, the opposition. Then they kind of committed to a 25% nom cut, which is much harder to do and much bigger. And that then affects your demographic trends that Matt's talking about. It affects a range of different parts of the economy and structurally alters the economy significantly. Um, Particularly because it looks like they've ruled out family visas and all those kind of things. The humanitarian cuts. There's only so many humanitarian visas. It's kind of coming from the skilled migrant workforce. So I don't think it's a boring or small election. I think there's quite a bit of differentiation about it. It's just maybe it's been so late and so much with so little detail, and the coalitions run such a bad campaign, and they don't really know what their policies are, and they've backflipped on a few of them. That's all kind of been murkied over, and we haven't been able to sort of sit down and think about it and discuss it. That's my kind of hot take.
now I would say I think that's true from the opposition. I think the government has a very light agenda. Very light. I mean, what are they promising to do? Really nothing. I mean, honestly, my frustration with the government has been, the morning after the last election, I wrote a piece in the Fin that urged the government not to do anything. I urged them not to do anything because what I was worried about is that they would come to government, and Labor governments often run into trouble with not having not enough to do, but having too much to do and not doing it well, doing too many things and not doing it well. And I said to them, just cool it, focus on the next election, take something meaningful to the next election. That should be your priority. Deliver what you said you'd deliver and take something to the next election. And they didn't take anything to the next election. I mean, they've taken little tiny policies, but there's nothing meaningful. And I would say, again, think about this. think about the last time. I keep going back to history, but this is good for you, Matt, because you'll learn something about Australia. Go
Australian
back,
law.
compare this first term to the first terms of previous changes of administration. Go back to 2013 and look at the first term of the Abbott government. The 2014 budget, like it or loathe it, was pretty ballsy. It was pretty full on, right? And the degree of fiscal consolidation in that first term was pretty meaningful. They launched a tax white paper process. They ran a commission of audit. They had a 2014 budget, which was wild, one of the boldest budgets I can remember. They delivered all the things they said they would deliver, and a lot of other things that they said they wouldn't deliver. But the point is, their first term was pretty bold. Now, Abbott didn't make it through his first term. And so, a lot of these things like the white paper died and didn't get anywhere. But the first term was meaningful. Go back to 2007 with Kevin Rudd. We had the carbon pollution reduction scheme. We had the Henry tax review. We had hospital reform. We had the mining tax. We had serious ambition in that first term. Now, the Prime Minister didn't survive the first term. Go back to 2007. Go back to 1996. The first term, we had serious stuff. inflation targeting formalized. We had the Asian financial crisis handled. We had fiscal consolidation. We had the Charter of Budget Honesty. We had the GST in the first term. The Prime Minister did survive the first term, only just. He lost a majority at the next election. He didn't have the popular vote, but they just squeaked back in. So the theme there is governments come into office and they want to do stuff, and they don't waste that political capital, they try and spend it. And sometimes it doesn't work out. But that's how the system is supposed to work. And this government is the first one I don't know. I can't think of the last one. Maybe Malcolm Fraser. You got to go back to probably Malcolm Fraser to find a government that in this first term really didn't do anything. And I think that's a disappointment. And I think it's on them. The fact that they're not taking anything to this election that's meaningful means the next 3 years is going to be a void, and we just delay any of the solutions that we need to our problems.
Yeah, that sounds like it's the sort of government that would suit settings when we're comfortable the settings are well established. And, the context, I view myself as very incrementalist. If we go back 20 years and we look at policy settings in Australia and New Zealand, I think a lot of things were pretty well set up. Why would you both think that there's more need for reform now than there may have been, prior to the GFC, for example?
Good question. I'll go first. Prior to the GFC, I was just a young whippersnapper then, Matt. I'll claim that. I wasn't really.
How old are you? When were you born, Lachlan? What year?
Do you want? I can give out my bank details on live TV too. No, 1990. So I can remember the GFC.
1986. I don't understand how this head of hair and that head of hair can be 4 years apart.
Fast approaching. Don't worry about that. That's why
Matt, what year were you born, Matt?
Facial.
I'm 83. I'm the oldest one.
Whoa!
I was actually a working economist during the GFC. Yeah. I was a metro forecaster. Whole different life.
Anyway, go on, Lachlan. Keep going.
No, I remember the GFC well because that's kind of my introduction to economics in a way. There was Kevin 07 as well, which kind of was the introduction to politics as well. So it was all a very fun time. And I just remember I spent most of my money at this time just reading newspapers, buying newspapers, and fascinating times.
We're the same person, mate. Sitting at uni, going to uni and buying. Well, maybe you didn't do this because you're a huge, lefty. But I used to buy the Australian. I used to go to the UQ newsagent, buy a copy of the Australian every day, and go and sit in the Great Court and read it. Read the comments section, and read Paul Kelly. And I recently caught up with Paul Kelly, and I said to him, mate, this is like amazing because little Steve back in 2004 used to sit in the Great Court of UQ and read you in the newspaper. So it must be our type, Lachlan. We're the same. We're the same person.
I read all newspapers. I don't discriminate. I spend most of my income on various news subscriptions. My favorite at the moment is actually Capital Brief. They're doing a great job. So
I agree. Very good.
Yeah.
Love Jen Duke.
Yeah. No, they're very good. So I actually think, again, maybe not the answer you're expecting. I don't think there is more of an impetus now than there was pre-GFC. I think our living standards recently are declining slightly, but our living standards have improved. And the main thing for me is, I suppose, like complacency in a sense. We've got productivity growth that has increasingly decreased in terms of its rate, and effectively flat since the start of COVID, like no productivity growth. Which it's not the end of the world. The whole we bang on about productivity a lot, but it's not everything. There's more things in life.
But it's almost everything.
It's almost everything. I didn't mean to go there, but you can't help yourself sometimes. And so I think the risk is if you're too complacent on it, in 10 years' time, you start to feel the bite of zero productivity growth, and you go, "Oh shit, we've got to do something about it." But there's no like clear lever you pull, and that says, if you want productivity growth, pull this lever. There's a question of what's effective, and then how you pull that lever, and there's cost to pulling that lever. And so then you get into a world of you might start pulling levers as the wrong levers because you haven't really understood the problem. And then they take another 5 to 10 years to kind of flow through into the economy. And so I think that's the risk. And so that's why we need to be talking about it now and thinking about it now and figuring out what we
Exactly.
can do now. And
Exactly.
like I said, there's no one thing. So you got to try and tilt, take the levers you think that will tilt the economy towards being more flexible and be able to generate productivity growth and see how that plays out rather than waiting until 10 years down the track and being like, oh, we're in trouble here.
Now, the negative view would be that I think the government will be returned. The negative view is that the government's just not interested. That would be
Productivity growth.
yeah, or not, or doesn't really think it. It doesn't get them out of bed in the morning. It doesn't. It isn't what makes them burn inside. Like I wrote a piece recently about like prosperity first, and I was trying to make the case to say you got to, this got to burn inside you like a thing that you're just obsessed with. And the pessimistic case is that just doesn't. That's not what they get out of bed in the morning. That Jim Chalmers doesn't go to bed thinking about how to boost productivity. It's just not the kind of guy he is. That's the pessimistic case. The optimistic case is, they came to an election without a platform because they got elected on the basis of not being Scott Morrison. They had a voice to Parliament, which was a political disaster and sucked up all of their kind of air, oxygen. I said a political disaster, saying nothing of the merits, but clearly politically it was bad. And that kind of blew up their first term. And so maybe they had no space left for anything else, in addition to trying to fight this inflation crisis, which was, a pretty big deal and difficult and challenging. So, the optimistic view is that if they get reelected, they'll have a lot more clear air.
Yeah.
And we'll get to see what they're made of, because now they have no excuses.
And I don't want to give too much credit, but to give them some credit, they've got a productivity fund that's kind of modeled on the NCP, the National Competition Payments, where they put up, I think it's $900 million for the states to do stuff that's competition enhancing. They're doing a little bit about Sparky, occupational recognition.
What's the thing in the budget? The
non-compete clauses.
Non-competes.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's little bits here and there.
I'm a big fan of the tax policy stuff, cutting the marginal rate from 19 to 14 and doing standard deduction. Big fan, excellent. So there's little embers. There's little embers there but the question is just, is this? I mean, maybe you just hope that Jim Chalmers cares a lot about his legacy, and if you want to be seen in history like Paul Keating, you got to do big things.
Yeah, and that's a trade-off facing policymakers, right? Like there's costs to doing some of these things, and they're potentially only around for 3 years, and they won't see most of the benefit of it. So it's kind of like you need them to be caring about their legacy or thinking they've got another step, maybe the prime minister in the future, to make them care about the things in the short term.
On legacy, so since I'm older, I'm going to do the old man thing and say, I think when people are thinking legacy, they're getting on in years and they will they'll imbue the framework and the types of products they see are given to them. So if economists have built a strong narrative around productivity, if they've built a strong story around it, that can be taken on. Someone can say they're doing a legacy product for that. In the same way, if someone has gone and pushed really bad policy, someone can take that up as their legacy as well. So I would just note that point and use it as a segue to Tom's questions.
Scream it from the rooftops.
Yeah. So Tom here has a couple of useful points. The first one is just noting when we're talking about sustainability, the health thing is tangential to super, and there are likely major issues to think through there. And I think at some point we could even discuss NDIS.
Yeah. Just quickly on that.
Oh, sorry.
Just quickly on Tom's point. It's a good point. Although it doesn't, that's the way it is now. It doesn't mean it has to be that way in the future. So, for example, aged care used to be, it is quite heavily government funded, and now there's been some changes that increases the user contribution, and I'm not an aged care expert, so I don't want to talk too much, but I think it's based on wealth and assets. And so if super's part of those wealth and assets, you then start getting some means testing effectively of aged care. And and that's, don't know how much of elderly use is healthcare versus aged care. So I don't want to, say stuff I don't know. But I could see a world in which you start means testing some of those things for higher wealth individuals. But he's right that at the moment it doesn't help with that.
So I would just say to his first question, I mean, I just mean super does help in the sense that the counterfactual without super, the budget would be absolutely hosed. So, good. Imagine that counterfactual. Look, I mean, come to the US. The budget is absolutely cooked, and the Social Security Trust Fund is insolvent. I mean, it's going to be insolvent in 5 years. It's like it's a genuine fiscal kind of problem, and we don't have that problem. That's all I meant on that. And then this Tom's second question, which is that what you just talked about or not?
No. So that one still needs to be read out. As the text man, I'll pass that on.
I was going to say I'm going to step out to you guys on this one.
He says Australia does not. I feel Australia does not have an income inequality problem, but an asset inequality problem. Wouldn't it be better to lower income taxes and increase asset-linked taxes? I take issue with the premise. This is all over again, isn't it, Matt? I'm taking issue with the premise of the question. Well, even let's not say asset. Let's say housing. Call a spade a spade. We don't have a stock or share inequality problem. Everyone's got superannuation, right? We've got a housing inequality problem. Now we don't have a housing. We actually don't have a housing inequality problem either, because there's very few people who don't have a house, and we can kind of solve. We should be able to solve the marginal issue, but we haven't done a great job of that. But we can. The issue is, home ownership inequality. And you just have to ask yourself if you think that's a problem. There's two paths. There's a path where we turn into Germany, where we just decide that, you don't need to own a house. What's the big deal? And we have to have a whole institutional structure that suits that outcome. Or we have mass liberalization of the housing market, like Auckland. Matt, you'll be familiar with that. And we no longer allow housing to be this nest egg. So they're the two options. I don't really have a view on which one is better.
So I think that all makes sense. The one thing I'll add is when we look at Australia, I think we import a lot of narratives about inequality, when actually top income share inequality is not that crazy in Australia like it is in the US. The Gini coefficient has been flat for absolutely yonks in terms of income. And even on the wealth side, it's not clear that there's big increases. More often when concerns are raised, it's exactly like Stephen's saying, things around access to housing. But if we were to think about income versus a wealth tax itself, like traditionally you'd say wealth taxes, we can think of them like a capital income tax. One's a tax on the stock, one's a tax on the flow, and they're harder to administer. So why the hell are we going to do that? That's why they were taken out around the rest of the world. More recently, people will say, well, with a wealth tax, you're only taxing the normal rate of return and people take risks. That's not going to be taxed, unlike a capital income tax. On the flip side, some people are saying you shouldn't tax the normal rate of return. That's double taxation of consumption through time. So we should do the opposite. So there's a whole lot of tax instruments we all talk about, and it sounds nice to say income or wealth, and we're taking away the taxation of labor. And it sounds nice in a headline, but we should be asking what taxes are equivalent, what are the actual wedges, and what's our framework and rationale for thinking about tax? Now, I think that question gets complicated, and I'm not here to solve it because I'm not able to.
Agree. The only caveat I would add is we ought to have a property tax regime. And that is a wealth tax that's actually easy to administer. And if designed in the right way, like in the ACT, Lachlan, are you in the ACT or are you in Sydney?
I'm in the ACT. I just bought a house Thursday.
So you'll pay land tax.
No, not yet, but eventually. They've already got it. Anyway.
but then the regime is in place, right? So, and the ACT does a pretty decent job by the standards of governments in removing the improved value from the tax base and trying to make it efficient. And I think we could rely a lot more on that as a house. And if we had significant land taxes, we got rid of stamp duty. I think that would meaningfully improve the functioning of the housing market. It would reduce house prices. It would be good, right? So that's a simple change that we could make. And I don't know a single economist who would disagree. Maybe, I don't know.
I do have another. I've got to head off soon, but you guys should keep going. But I do have another hot take. I've been thinking. Well, it's not really a hot take; it's a prediction. I think. So I think we're all working on the assumption of a return Labor government, right? Whether it's majority, minority, which says a lot about the coalition campaign. Unless there's some insane poll herding. I was looking at some blogs on poll herding last night.
Yeah,
looked like
I thought about that too. Yeah, I thought about that.
Doesn't look like as much as 2019. I think there'll be another tax white paper, is my prediction. That the government will then take to a third election. Because they've committed to no tax changes beyond what they've got in their platform.
And I think that's fair enough.
Yeah. So I think, we've had, since Ken Henry, we had Rethink. Was there another one?
No, but that wasn't actually a tax white paper.
Okay.
They did a discussion paper, and then the Prime Minister switched before the actual white paper came out.
Yeah.
So we haven't had anything since the Henry Review, actually. It's been 15 years.
So I reckon we could be in the market. So it's a good time to be a tax economist in Australia, I reckon.
Yeah, and I think the risk, and we might have talked about this, Matt, before, but I think the risk there is bad policy. And something I want to, and maybe I think I'm going to write something for the Fin for Monday's paper, sort of talking about a re-elected government, what it should, presumably it will be re-elected, and if it is re-elected, what they should do. And I think what I really want to impress on them is, you and I might have different values, or we might have different, social welfare weights. But we ought to be able to agree on, if I take as given your preference for redistribution, we ought to be able to agree on the best way to implement that. And I think where I've disagreed with the government over the last 3 years is not, I think you hear Jim Chalmers frequently in press conferences say, commentary by right-wing commentators or, partisans, he calls them. And, no doubt at least once that's referred to me. But my critique of the government has absolutely nothing to do with ideology. Because I can say, I have friends in the Labor Party, lots and lots of friends in the Labor Party. I have more friends in the Labor Party than I do in the Liberal Party. And I can say to them, mate, you tell me what you want to achieve, and I'll help you do it. There's a huge space ought to be a huge space of objective agreement, conditional on our values. And that's what I'm disappointed by the government, is the policy has been bad, even if you're progressive. And so what I worry about going forward is we don't make that, we don't bridge that gap.
The inefficiency of it all. So I think the good example there is the student HECS cuts, right?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I was literally going to say that.
It's the most infuriating thing. But I understand where they're coming from in terms of, there's some, higher education is expensive now, and we can argue about it should be expensive. People get private returns. We can argue about all of that.
I actually don't think it is expensive, but yes.
But there's a relative question. But let's take that as given, and they want to fix that. And so instead of they had a higher education accord, a higher education accord, a whole review process. Instead of implementing or taking policies from that and trying to do whatever they want to do at the front end of the system to adjust the fee setting basis, they've gone for a really lazy, rather than doing that, we're just going to cut 20%. And we're not going to target it. We're just going to give everyone a 20% cut. And it's just the laziest, regressive, poor
It's
policy.
shocking. It's
And
shocking.
you could
The
almost
people
see,
who should be most angry about that policy are progressives.
and you could almost see the Americanization of it in the way they advertised it on the socials.
Student debt forgiveness.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Um,
You got to be joking. Are you sure you want to emulate the Biden administration?
I think the point you're making about the efficiency or inefficiency of what you're trying to achieve, right? And I agree with that.
Yes. And in governments gone past, including the Rudd government, including the Hawke Keating government, that mattered. The efficiency really mattered. This is the government who proposed this carbon pollution reduction scheme. This is the government that proposed the resource super profit tax.
Yeah.
These are policies that would be considered neoliberal, derisively. And they've lost that. They've lost that respect for basic, rational kind of frameworks. And I think it bit them hard in this 3-year period. I think they feel vindicated that inflation is finally back in the target. And I'm like, dude, inflation's been out of the target for 3 years. That's really bad. That's really bad. It didn't need to be that way. And I think that you get mugged by reality. It's not that. Put it this way: it's in your own political interests to respect the laws of economics. And if they'd respected the laws of economics in the last 3 years, they'd been in a much better position today. And I worry that going forward, they will take the wrong lesson away. They will continue to say economics doesn't matter. Murray Watt, the employment minister, was out saying that we can have wage increases without productivity increases.
Yeah, I saw that.
I mean,
we can. It's not going to end well.
We absolutely can.
There's a specific term that keeps being used, and it's getting to the point that wherever I hear this term, I know that it's reflecting bad faith in the person not really willing to discuss the issue. And it's discussing, and it's different when you have it in a conversation with someone to where you hear this in public. So it's when someone says we're doing this policy because of political practicality, or ultimately there has to be this political thing around it. So rather than trying to understand what's first best, is that actually a politically feasible? That's the term, politically feasible policy. Stop talking that way. Yes. Figure out what first best is, describe it to the public, talk about the trade-offs and options you can do around it, and then work out feasibility from that. Don't start from, I'm going to guess what's feasible. Yes. Because what happens then is you just, and again, I'm going to say this is just from me, not from you guys, because I'm going to be contentious now. This is effing ministers' offices trying to say, look, we want to do X. Our minister's concerned about this issue. This is feasible. Whatever our brain fart is that we've just come up with, we're going to push this and say it's feasible and ignore what experts are saying and the way it's being talked about. And the more policies done like that, the more dangerous it becomes and the further we get from good discussion. And then people in public don't trust what's happening because of that. So I just think that's been corrosive. And I've seen that increase over the last decade, no end. Both in Australia and New Zealand. This is not an Australia only issue.
And I think that what that highlights, Matt, and I agree wholeheartedly, what that highlights is the importance of process. And we used to, and this was epitomized by the Rudd government. Now, again, the Rudd government's a hard example because they burnt down in flames. So it's hard to say do it like Rudd did it. But Rudd had his own issues. But if you look at the CPRS, I think the carbon pollution reduction scheme, that is an extraordinary policy making process. Now, it didn't get up. And I think, frankly, it didn't get up because Rudd balked. He balked. And if he just stuck to his guns, it might have worked and he might have stayed Prime Minister, right? But I think the point is, go back and look at the policy process behind the carbon pollution reduction scheme. They had state-based emissions trading schemes. pre-2007, and all of the states were Labor governments. And they collectively, with the states, the state governments, and Ryder's opposition leader, commissioned Ross Garnaut to do the Garnaut review. So he went away and he did an independent review, and he recommended an emissions trading scheme. Then they came to government. They set up a green paper process, and then a white paper process, and then they produced legislation. And there was a huge amount of consultation and with a huge amount of work to make sure everyone was on board. And ultimately, unfortunately, Tony Abbott challenged Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership, and the whole thing burnt down in flames. But, that's just bad luck in some sense. I think the point is the process is what guards against all the things that you're talking about, Matt. It makes sure you have a proper process. And if you look at all the bad policy outcomes, there was no process. I mean, the coalition's mortgage interest deduction that they cooked up in the last minute of the campaign, Treasury would never have let that get out of the lab. If they were the government, Treasury would have, walked over broken glass to prevent that from becoming policy. And I know in the past they have, when various ministers at times have wanted to do it. And when something escapes that process, you get bad outcomes. So I hope, Lachlan, your point is true, which is that it's a tax white paper process. It's actually a process that can involve, proper consultation, proper input, proper scrutiny. That's what I would favor.
Yeah, nothing gets the people going like process. As an ex-bureaucrat, I love it. I do have to run, but I'm going to leave you guys to it. I see there's comments piling up, and one of them is from our colleague Matt Maltman, asking for political betting advice. So I just firstly state
can we talk about that? Let's just briefly talk about that before you go.
This is general advice in nature, whatever you got to say.
Hey, Phil Jameson. Phil Jameson is my mate here at DC. He's an Australian, and he's in DC. He's asked a question. So the political betting advice. I haven't put any money. I haven't put any money on this election. I won the last federal election. I netted about $2,000. I bet on like Tangy. I had an insane betting thing. I bet on the seat number. I bet on everything.
Who gave you the inside word on Tangy? I don't think anyone was betting on Tangy.
I'm an oracle. I have friends who work in each party, and so I get they tell me, what the inside polling is saying. I haven't done any betting this time.
You're a big follower of dolphin trainers. That's a guy who runs Tangy. He's a dolphin trainer.
Yes, I know.
So Matt's question, is Dan Tehan going to lose his seat? So Dan Tehan is the opposition immigration minister, I'm pretty sure. And he's in the seat of Wannon in southwestern Victoria, God's country. And he's being run against by Alex Dyson, ex-Triple J host for the
Oh, wow! I used to love Alex Dyson. I didn't know that was the same guy. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think he did it as a bit of a joke the first time, and then the second or third time he came close, which was last election. And
I used to listen to him on Triple J. Yeah.
Yeah, the odds are the even odds. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I haven't really been on the ground there. I suspect.
Are you from Victoria?
Yeah, I'm from down south. From near Ballarat. So
that makes me feel differently about you, but anyway, carry on.
I'm used to this cold weather in Canberra. I think he'll come really close and fall because I understand the coalition put a lot of money into the electorate and a lot of attack ads. And I think that's the last hurdle. But you need kind of like a it's time or anti Scott Morrison sentiment. And they just don't have that to get him over the line. So I think that's the risk there. But I'd love to see him get up. His campaign symbol is orange kelpies. He doesn't have cornflakes, just has orange kelpies everywhere.
That's great.
Which I love. And then who will be the opposition leader if the polls are right and the ALP is returned? I think Peter Dutton.
This is a very no. Dutton's gone, mate. Dutton's gone.
No, they got no one to go to.
Okay,
lift out the shadow ministry. Lift it out. Who's in the shadow ministry?
Dutton. I mean, if Dutton has had a terrible campaign by any measure.
Yeah, great.
I frankly think the people have got a look at him and have decided, nah. I mean, that news poll was 60 unfavorable, 30 favorable is extraordinary. That is like Tony Abbott after he did Knights and Dames level of bad. Okay. So he is not going to win another election. I don't think anyone in that party will believe
Have
he
you
can
seen
win
the
another
Christopher
election.
Pine interview about that? You got to watch it. The Christopher Pine interview, Annabelle Crabb.
Oh no, I
interviews
have.
him.
I have. Yes.
Oh.
He couldn't believe it.
It's
So
good.
you know, Dutton. I mean, honestly, I mean, we were all waiting to see what would happen, and I think people got to look at the merchandise and they realize they don't like it. I think that's. I mean, we'll see what happens tomorrow, but I think that's what happens. So, I think, I don't think there are a lot of alternatives. I think a lot of people talk about Andrew Hastie, but he doesn't have a lot of experience.
Too experienced.
And I think the only option is Angus Taylor. He's the only option. There's no other option. And so I don't know. Dutton cannot continue. If Dutton doesn't make any meaningful gains, he has to step down. And I think there is literally the only other option is Angus Taylor. And I think that's what they'll do.
There could be a bottle of champagne on this, I reckon, Stephen. Yeah, I'm just looking at the sports bet odds. Angus Taylor, if Dutton goes, Angus Taylor $1.50, Hasty $5, Susan Lee $8.50, Dan Tan 10, David Coleman 20. So that gives you a sense of there's
so
no one.
It's Angus or Hasty, but Hasty is too green. It's not enough. So I think Angus is the only option, and is Angus's credible choice. So I think
it's the party won't choose Angus. I'm willing to put. What are you drinking today, Steve?
Look, it is actually a nice bottle. It's Bollinger. So just what I had in the fridge. Someone actually brought it to my house for dinner, a fellow economist, and so it was sitting there. I was like, okay, it's the election. We're going to drink one of my favorites, James Bond's choice. So no, I'll bet you a bottle of Bollinger, Angus Taylor, with the opposition leader after the election.
Okay, happy to take that. Feeling good about that.
Wonderful.
Matt,
but yeah, Matt, was that more than you bargained for, mate? I don't know. And what about?
I got it. I have to run. But you guys should keep chatting.
It's very disappointing.
Yeah. I mean, I've only got about 10 minutes, but I think Stephen, should we finish off our friends' questions here? And
let's do that.
Lachlan. Sorry, I scared you off with the minister's office points, but love people.
You did scare me off. I'm not a huge fan of ministers' offices. Happy to put that on the record. But someone has to do it, and they're willing to take the punishment. So
yeah.
Good to chat, mate. Have a good democracy sausage for us all.
Very excited.
See you, mate. What do we got here? We got Tom. 100% housing.
We got Oscar as well. So Oscar's just above him.
Okay, sorry.
So how much do federal housing policies matter versus the land reforms happening at the state level that look like they're a lot better? So how much are we unlocking supply due to the fact that there's these changes in state policies, even though everything at the federal level looks demand-based?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And it's important to recognize that federal government doesn't control housing policy. And I did the Joe Walker podcast with Richard Holden not that long ago, and Peter Chulip was in the audience. And I said, there's this view, and Grattan has put this forward, and others have put this forward, that the federal government should bribe, or it could be stick or carrot, but provide financial incentives for the states to pressure local governments to release housing supply. And I just have look, I agree they should, but I'm just puzzled as to why that works. Why is it in the incentives? Why is it in the interests of the federal government, but why is it not in the interests of the state governments? I don't really understand how the incentives are misaligned. It doesn't. Peter's argument at the Joe Walker podcast was that it's state spillovers, but come on, mate, they're pretty small. I don't think that's really what's going on, right? So while I agree, like that seems to be the answer, I don't really understand how that works.
And I think I agree with both of you, but in the following way, right? I think a state's big enough for a lot of the spillovers to actually be internalized within the state.
Exactly.
And I think you see that with state governments actually actively trying to increase supply. It's the next layer down, the local government. they're the ones that are resistant. So you talked about Auckland earlier. What happened in Auckland is they made it. There was many local councils, and they made it into what was called a super city, and like they amalgamated all the councils and forced them to plan together. And it was after that process that they started saying, why are we imposing? So there were restrictions like if you had a line of sight of one of the 7 volcanoes around Auckland, you could not build above a very high height. It was just ridiculous because it was something you were supposed to be able to look at. It was an amenity to look at a non-active volcano, right? So they just were ripping out a lot of that stuff once they formed that bigger amalgamation. And another way to view that is they were ripping out that local power for the smaller local governments. And so rejigging things at the state to local level to allow it feels like it's more pertinent for allowing supply than worrying too much at the federal level. So I think I agree with you in that sense, but I agree with Peter in terms of there being that spillover type argument.
Yeah, so I don't know. So I think, it's a good question. And I think that there's no doubt that most of the action is at the sub-federal level. And I to the extent that the federal government, maybe you could argue the states have a kind of liquidity constraint or something. The federal government has easier access to capital. It can raise money easier. It can maybe that's the argument. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for the nuclear option of just insane levels of financial incentives for state governments to pressure local governments to liberalize supply. And I would also make the point that I think local governments, while they have talked big, there's been a lot of walking back of what they had earlier suggested they would do. And so I think we'll wait and see whether they actually deliver the goods,
While we cover another question, I'll just note, since Matt Maltman's in the chat, and he's recently published on the lower housing supply issues and the nature of reforms over there, he's probably the most knowledgeable person about these things that's in this chat right now. So feel free to throw something in, Matt. We'd love to see it. So Tom says...
So we've addressed Oscar. Yeah, now we're at Tom.
Yeah. So now we're back to Tom. He's saying he was totally talking about a housing problem. And, he's seeing how you could raise funds from those to help pay for other priorities. So that comment is very much disagreeing with you, Stephen, which, I'm sure...
Well, no, I made the point that you could do land taxes.
Yeah.
And you and me on our other, when I was on your podcast previously, we talked about the reforms that need to be made to the, capital income tax regime, which would I think help the housing market to some degree. So the combination of that plus the stamp duty to land tax switch, I think would be a meaningful improvement in the taxation of housing. So I don't think we disagree with Tom. Phil.
Perfect. And then now we're up to... We'll cover Tom's next one as well. He's saying that he's going for Hasty for the next leader, because he's a good-looking guy.
Don't discount the good-looking factor. He is a handsome guy, and I would say the other thing is he has a very good voice. I heard his voice recently, and I was like, he has a good voice for like radio. That guy.
Yeah.
So maybe, but he's just a bit green. But Mark Latham was pretty green in 2004, and the Labor Party had no problem putting him up. So we'll see. But again, I think Angus Taylor is the obvious choice, but we'll see. So what does Phil say? Who would be the best MPs in a re-elected Albanese government? Andrew Charlton.
I have to agree with that by definition, given he...
stop.
Yeah. Given...
It would be great. It would be great if Albanese resigned. That Jim Chalmers was made the Prime Minister and that Andrew Charlton would be made the Treasurer. And I think a Jim Chalmers Prime Minister and an Andrew Charlton Treasurer would be an outstanding improvement in the state of affairs. But, that's maybe too much to ask for. Andrew Charlton, I will, note that, he's the founder of E61, your employer, and is my friend. I've had a bit to do with him over time. I think he's an outstanding individual, but unfortunately has been languishing on the backbench. And I don't think Phil will be surprised.
Your first-term experience, right? So it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
So I think, and I just think maybe the momentum comes from, maybe there might be some retirements. We've had Brendan O'Connor, retire. There might be other retirements, and there's just a natural, at this point in the government, people retire. That makes room for people to come through. Yeah, it makes sense. Chris,
what would you like to see a re-elected Labor government do to improve productivity?
What do you think, Matt?
Oh, that's a big question. So, like, I'll say something a little bit sneaky here. Again, New Zealand labor productivity is 30% lower, and I've never been a big productivity guy, seeing it as more an intermediate thing. I want to see more efficiency in the tax system. I want to see more neutral treatment of things in terms of taxation. I want to see an increase in the relative GST rate, lowering of income taxes, and then I want to see how that plays through on private behavior. It could lead to some productivity increases, but even if it doesn't, it's an increase in efficiency. It's an increase in people meeting, improving their social welfare. And so I would be prioritizing tax reform. Australia just needs more neutrality.
Matt, do you have an issue? So Albo's big personal issue, Albo's number one issue that he's flagged is childcare. Do you have a view about childcare?
So it's interesting. I do have a view about childcare, which is that, I understand we want to set up a situation where families and households are supported to be able to re-enter the labor market if they want to. I would do it through making sure people have income. I don't like encouraging participation by going and subsidizing certain things. So I wouldn't be doing it through the childcare system. I mean, I'd be asking if there's competition issues in the childcare system, which I'd want to unravel. But rather than subsidies, I'd be thinking about just providing income to households.
Yes, I think that's an excellent answer. And I would say, I think when you talk about childcare, you have to think carefully about what the problem is, what the objective is, and then what's the right way to solve the problem. And I just fundamentally disagree that the objective is to maximize female workforce participation. I just completely disagree with that as being the objective. Are you still there, Matt? You've gone dark.
I am. I've got a second camera, especially for this moment. Okay. So I've reappeared now.
So, hey, you've got your E61 hat. That's good. I had my Michigan hat on upstairs, but I don't have it down here. So I think that I think there's no doubt that there are all sorts of barriers to female labor force participation. I'm totally aware of that. I'm aware of the literature on dynamic effects on lifetime income. One of my colleagues, Alira Kuka, is like an expert in this area. Like, I'm fully aware, but I just don't think the objective is to maximize female labor force participation. I think some women make a fair, totally valid decision that they want to take some time out to look after their kids, and that's fine. I don't think we should be discouraging that decision. And I think your point is right, Matt. I think the point is we want to address disincentives and we want to address income inequality and maybe liquidity shortages. And to the extent the tax system can help and the transfer system can help with that, I think that would be a great idea. The current system, which funnels enormous subsidies through private childcare providers, I think is a disaster.
Yeah.
More or less established by Scott Morrison, I should argue, as as the relevant minister at the time, social services. It's a terrible system. So to take the existing system and just to funnel more money into it, I think we're going to end up with enormous cost for very little gain. I would prefer to move to a system where, for example, pre-3 is dealt with by childcare centres and post-3 is dealt with by primary schools and funded in the way that other primary school programs are. So I think that's Albo's issue is childcare. I just worry that he won't do so in a way that is kind of the most sensible. But otherwise, I agree with your basic point, which is tax reform is the key priority.
And I think towards all of this, like the growing nature of social transfers in kind in Australia compared to standard redistribution, it's a big change relative to the fundamental Australian model, which is redistribution and regulation. And this is happening by stealth because of middle class handouts. It just screams director's law, and I feel like it needs to be called out and talked about.
We should. We need, as we've discussed before, we need to do a lot more work. We need to do a lot more work in understanding how that system works. I think it's taken for granted that it's effective and low cost. I think we need to focus on. We've got a process to learn, I think, about how it works and what its issues are.
Yeah.
And there is, as far as I understand, there does not exist one academic article on the functioning of Australia's tax and transfer system. I mean, the transfer part of that system.
Yeah.
Have you read one?
No, but I mean, it's an open area to do
I haven't
work.
read one. Yeah, I haven't read one. Right.
We should definitely chat more about that. On childcare as well, I'll note that my colleagues Sylvia Griselda, Aaron Clark, and Rose Qatar have come up with work on that. They know a lot more about the childcare system than I do. And they've found really, again, they've focused on describing it. We're economists. We're not trying to say do X or Y. And I think their work's really interesting for painting how the system works and how it interacts with the tax transfer system. And essentially, what they find is these very high effective marginal tax rates and effective average tax rates for relatively low to middle income earners, due to the childcare subsidies, prices are being bumped up. The whole system just looks like it needs to be thought about more.
Yes.
And so their example of doing that work is really important. And,
yes.
It would be great to do more of that. I'd like to be doing stuff like that on job seeker payment. I just think there is so much space for us to try to add value as a community. So I agree.
So Matt has asked, how would the tax-free threshold work with a larger standard deduction? Would you lower it one? Now, he hasn't watched our conversation with Richard Holden.
I think I think that's where he got the question from, because
we asked it. We asked this exact question, didn't we?
Yeah.
Didn't we answer this question? Which is, no, you wouldn't change the tax-free threshold, because if you, as I said when I responded to your question during the other podcast, if you offset it with a reduction in the tax-free threshold, you're making people worse off, right? Because you're swapping a reduction in unconditional tax for a reduction in conditional tax. In other words, you only get the tax cut if you don't have deductions. So you're going to make people worse off, and you can't do that. That's politically infeasible. So I don't care. It's fine. The tax-free threshold has been the tax-free threshold. Hang on. Huh?
You just said politically infeasible.
No, but that's okay. But I also think the tax-free threshold has been where it has been in nominal terms since when? I think it would be 10 years.
2012, is it?
Yeah, I mean 50 exactly. 10 or 15 years. $18,200 has been the tax-free threshold for and in real terms, that's fallen dramatically. So my view would be a $3,000 standard deduction. The Labor's proposing a $1,000 deduction, but if you did $3,000, that'd be like, it is equivalent to increasing the threshold, but it has a much bigger benefit than increasing the threshold, which is that you draw people out of the set of people who are claiming deductions, and that moves you to a system of much more compliance and much lower administrative and ATO costs. So I think, I don't think the interaction between the tax-free threshold and the standard deduction is that relevant, frankly. So.
Although it does remove it from the taxation of capital income. So, within that context, given the current system, it would mean that we're not, if we, instead of increasing the tax-free threshold, we offer a standard deduction, it will not show up in terms of the treatment of capital income. But as you've noted before, capital income taxation is probably something we should be thinking about reform about. And, TTPI has done a whole lot of work going through options there as well.
They have.
That would be a fun topic to go through one day.
I mean, there's no question that the tax-free threshold should not apply to capital. It doesn't make any sense. So why are you giving people tax-free capital income? It's bizarre. I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? So, I mean, that's another reform that needs to happen. Is there anything else you want to chat about, Matt, or do you need to leave?
I do need to go to the doctor soon, so I'm a little bit over time, but it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. So thanks for the chat, and thanks everyone for the questions. Definitely a lot more activity than I anticipated, so that's great.
That's good. So I think we need. So one is I've bet that the Labor's going to pick up 75 seats. So let's see if that happens. I'm going to wake up at what time do I have to wake up? I have to wake up. I want to log in at 6 p.m. So I think I need to wake up at 5 a.m. Is that correct? I think so. 5 a.m. is. Yeah, 5 a.m. will be 7 p.m. So I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning to watch the coverage. My bet is 75 seats. A Labor gets.
I'm going
they
70
retain.
because I want
70?
the independents to be determining the government.
Yeah, then that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And then I owe Lachlan a bottle of Bollinger if Angus Taylor is not the next opposition leader. Sorry, this may have been a very expensive podcast.
Yeah. With this as well. So how long does it take for the results to get counted in New Zealand? It's mixed member proportional. You know the results within 15 minutes because they're just able to project because they're just collected from around the country quickly. And
Yes,
you've got like 4 or 5%. You know what the results are.
No. So have you watched an election before here?
No. I can't.
You have to. Are you going to watch tonight?
Yeah, definitely.
So watch the ABC. The ABC is the best. That's Anthony Green. Don't watch anything else. I watch the ABC. The hate media, it's called. So it's an amazing thing because what you see, it's a bit like the US is similar. You see like one booth will come in, like literally one booth. And everyone will freak out. It'll be like, oh my God, this booth is 90% liberal. And then it's like, it's one booth, guys, and it's in a really conservative area. So basically, in the first hour, you learn nothing. So between 6 and 7 p.m., nothing happens. But as the results start to come in, there's basically key seats. There's about 20 seats in the country, which really matter. And as you start to see those numbers creep up, and the law of large numbers applies pretty quickly. You maybe see 5% reporting, and from that point that basically the projections are going to be accurate. And the only drawback is one, Western Australia doesn't come in until 3 hours later, right? Because they're on the West Coast. So last year, Western Australia was very important to Labor getting government, and so that was a bit delayed. And then the other big thing is, now with the increase in preferences, given that basically the number of seats which have to go to preferences to determine the outcome, because the candidate hasn't received more than 50%, so you basically end up going to preferences. That can take longer to figure out who the winner is, and that can drag out over a week or two. So we could see, there's recounts. So my guess is we'll know on the night. I mean, I think it'll be clear if there is not a significant swing to the opposition, the government's going to retain government. That's basically it. And so I think we'll know that by the end of the night, but we'll see.
Nice. Well, it's exciting.
Cool, mate.
Have a good rest. Cheers for the chat and cheers for Lachlan, even though he's gone. Always great.
Here's to democracy. I wish it's very sad being in the US, but maybe in the future I'll be back and I can I can eat a democracy sausage I vote on election day because I think it's like it's special. There's something special about it. So
No,
thanks so much for everyone who's tuning in who came on. It says there's 7 people.
It peaked about 16, which was pretty cool.
Nice. And thank you, Matt, for setting this up.
That was fun.
Yeah, good stuff.
Au revoir.
All right. Cheers, mate.
Yeah, bye.
See ya.